Hello and welcome to Tyne and Wear branch of the Geographical Association. My name is Brenda Turnbull and I'm the branch chair. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Cowans, who's given several excellent talks on the Ouseburn Valley area of Newcastle and using it as a superb case study for AS and A-level geography in particular. So we're going to divide this into two talks, about half an hour each, and these were originally given as part of a workshop, as you'll see from the screen, about St Lawrence and St Peter's wards on the north bank of the River Tyne. They were done live at King's Priory School earlier this year, 2023. So this first section is about industrialisation, and then there will be another recording that you can watch about deindustrialisation and the consequences of these areas. So with no further ado, I shall hand over to Liz.
Right, thanks very much indeed. I wanted to look at the St Lawrence and the St Peter's area because it brings into context the idea of why should an area on the side of the Tyne industrialise, and then when it has done, what happens to it later on when industrialisation stops and you get the loss of employment and the loss of factories. So we're going to look at industrialisation along with the idea of where you can get information from, and that includes the idea of maps, statistics, articles, and also the use of words, which is important so that you can use them with confidence, whether you're using it in an answer for a question or whether or not it's going to be your personal inquiry. We're going to be looking at industrialisation, and the area is going to be the north bank of the River Tyne. We're looking at industry and how it evolved over time. There is a caveat here because when you are the first to industrialise, you get a large share of market, but later on other people start to develop their industries and you're left behind. I've included the idea of maps for the area, 1898, 1916, and little tasks pop up. So for example, at the end, could you identify and describe changes which took place? What happened? Where was the increase in building? The maps are in a task folder, but they're also on this PowerPoint. Where and why did industry develop? It includes the idea of industrial linkage, and industrial linkage links all of the different industries. So for example, if you've got a factory, it means that it's got to have components, and that can be seen in the establishment of factories today. And so for example, if you had a shipbuilding industry, you need rope, you need engines, you need sails, etc. The closer you can get to the factory with the use of these components, the greater your profit, and obviously the better transport time. We're looking at the north bank of the River Tyne, and for some of you it will be local. The areas are St Lawrence and St Peter. St Peter's especially because we're going to look at it, how it transforms over time. And we're looking at where it is, what the land is like, where it was built and improved, the components and the output, what was made here, linkage between different factories, the multiplier effect, markets, labour, energy source and the finished product, and also events which take place which are going to affect our industry. Getting maps can be interesting, and the sources that you can go to, for example, the local studies at the main library in Newcastle, but you will be able to find those in your own area. And this is an area showing St Peter's Works at the bottom and along in the curve, going into St. Lawrence and into the city itself. Our area is shown by the pink square there. It's down at the bottom. It's got a railway to the north and the river to the south. It's got the railway which links right the way along the northern bank of the river, which makes import of raw materials easy. And also, as most of the things that it produced were used by railways, it was a ready market. So it was easy and relatively cheap to maneuver and take your products along the railway line. Place names are important on maps as well. I'm hoping that you can actually work out where it shows. There's a place called Mushroom, for example. There's a place in the Ousburn called Lime Street because there was a huge lime kiln there. Mushroom, not because they grew mushrooms, which is, I suppose, a nice possibility, but it sprang up overnight, a very, very rapid development. So the local people decided they were going to call it Mushroom. And also, of course, you need workers, you need flat land, you need water, you need components, but the workers are close enough to be able to walk to work, which was important because the wages would not be that high. The river, of course, is if you're making ships or you're making components for ships, as St. Peter's was, it would be very important to be able to launch your vessels off the land. Now, this was great to begin with, and we'll see the size of our named example later on, but it's a double-edged sword, really, because shipbuilding developed huge ships, and that was the beginning of the death knell for Newcastle. However, currently, in our 1898 map, we've got lots of things which promote and help shipbuilding. Open land as well, of course, was there, and we have, if we look now at 1916, remember this is during the First World War, and its dates could vary a little bit, but all of a sudden you see you've got so much more housing development at the top, and you've still got the railway working, and St. Peter's is expanding, and you've got industry developing along that northern bank, linked, of course, to Gateshead, where you have the Alhusen chemical works. So it was lots of different raw materials for making our end product. I thought it would be nice if you had a named example. And there's a factory called Hawthorn Leslie, which was in St. Peter's Basin, as is today. Hawthorn Leslie was formed next to the river, and you can look at the map to show where the factory was located. There's our map, that's the map, and there's our factory. And you'll notice that it's got areas where you've got rail links coming off, mineral lines. It makes something which is very big and very heavy, and it's got to be able to be transported, and road would not cut it on this site. Hawthorn Leslie had, if you look at the photograph there, massive cranes. There are cranes at the back, which are the Titan cranes. You also have railway lines where you have very, very strong cranes, and you have a jammed site. So Hawthorn Leslie was the engineering and shipbuilding. This was the marine engineering and the railway. And you can see those there. There's your Titan crane, there's the river, and there's your railway lines. All things which you need for a heavy raw material and heavy product. And a Titan crane would be able to lift boilers, and they would go for railway engines, again using coal as a power source. And we'd be thinking about, obviously, if power sources change, for example, if trains run on electricity or diesel, that's going to affect people like Hawthorn Leslie, who were producing boilers for steam engines. ships were either brought to our site and the actual engines were dropped in, or the engines could be floated upriver, and that would go to the Hawthorn Leslie shipbuilding yard. One thing that is important is clear signage when you're doing anything like this, so nice big sort of clear signage, and also to actually say where you got a photograph from. So this one came from Tugs and Time Builders. It's very important to give credit to other people and where they have taken photographs, etc. It's important that you give them the kudos of taking it. If we look at our photograph of St. Peter's, it was a crammed site, and you can see where the railway is, and the factory buildings are almost right up to the side of the river. But this site is not going to allow expansion. It was great when it began. It had everything going for it. It had water, it had workers, it had the railway line, and it was making something which was used by another factory, the shipbuilding one, and it was doing engineering and electrical engineering. But if you look at that, you don't really see much room for expansion because they're almost built right to the edge of the riverbank. So if we have these two areas shown on the slide with a little bit of information underneath, there is no way that site's going to expand because the shape of the valley itself rises steeply. So it's not going to be easy to expand or change this site in order to make it more profitable and more viable. There's an area at the back which is lined in green, and this is the steep bits, the steep rise in the valley sides. There's no building there. There are houses to the left, but beyond the green bits, there are areas where you've got allotments. It's not fit for building on. So to begin with, the site was excellent. It was everything that you could hope for. But as times changed and refurbishment may have been needed, it would be incredibly difficult. The sister shipyard was Hawthorn Leslie, and that was round the bend at Hebburn. That was on the Gateshead side. You can just see from this the amount of development and building and materials which would have been here. And there would have been a lot of jobs for people who lived locally, who could walk to work. Families would live there and work entire lives in the same place. And it was a bit like coal mining, you know, your granddad worked here, you're working here, which makes it even more devastating should anything happen. And the size of the ships made by Hawthorn Leslie were just the right size for the actual river. Anything bigger and you would end up launching straight into the next bank. And you can see from this one again how crowded it was. There is not a lot of space there. And it was either, if it didn't survive, then demolition, a total change would have to have been instigated. But you can see the different kinds of vessels made. Sometimes they were for transport, sometimes they were for war vessels, sometimes they would have been ferries. But the actual docks, where you look at the size of the ships, although it would have been great at the time, ultimately it was going to be too small to deal with competition from other parts of the world. Again, at the bottom, Tyne and Weir Archives and Museums, thank you. And the photograph was by Turners. It's not good if you just talk about historical events, because remember, whatever you're doing is going to be a geographical survey, it's going to be a geographical piece of work, but it's often nice to know where things came from. And if you were doing a written answer, it might be nice just to be able to use information that you've got and background knowledge. And that's where the census would come in. geography and changing place, it can include the idea of census data. And you can find out a lot about what people did as jobs, where they lived, what the housing conditions were like, how many people lived in a certain house or a room. And it can help you get a background, get a feeling about what the social problems and the social advantages were of living in a particular area. Census are taken every 10 years, except for obviously when you have wars, and you can find census material for 1881 and 1911 on the Eusburn Trust website. You can get them from the Central Library, Local Studies at Blandford Street, and lots of heritage sites would give you information about individual households. Remember, this is going to be secondary data. According to the archives and census, you've got to have a gap of 100 years, and that's because you've got to keep people's identity safe. So the most recent census data was released in 2021 for 100 years before, which was 1921. Remember copyright. If it's somebody else's photograph, you must give credit. And if it's for education, you should be all right. The census sheets are no different. There's a copyright statement at the edge. You can, according to the Census Board, use information as long as it's for education. So you're all right there, you're covered. This is what a census sheet would have looked like. And it has different sections. The first section shows the names of the people who are living there. And if you click on it, it'll show you a circle around it. There were 5 people living in that household. The next bit tells you about who was there, who was living. So if you click on that one, it'll give you that. And the occupations on the next one shows what people do. They included a lodger there. So that was 5 people. And it shows also where they were born. If you click again, and at the bottom, it tells you everybody was living in one room. That included the lodger. So it can tell you a lot. And funny enough, it's called David Cowan. So that's no relative. So basically, I think that's where we're up to now. We've looked at the idea of the river. We've looked at the idea of a site. We know that there are going to be areas of building for housing, and we know about industrial linkage, and also about the idea of a multiplier effect. When you have an industry located, a factory, it impacts on the area and it perks everywhere up, and industries will feed it with different things which they need to make a product. So we've looked at a success story, we've looked at Victorian enterprise, we've looked at the idea of building things which people want. And the big thing, of course, is that other areas were not quite as developed as we were. So we were first off the blocks and made a lot of money. Victorians were very good at making a lot of money, but it was invested in the area and people relied heavily on using those factories to maintain their lives. And so we'll look at the idea of what went wrong in our next presentation.